Welcome back to another interview episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. My guest today really needs no introduction. He is co-founder, together with his wife, of online systems that then become Sierra Online, that then becomes Sierra, a company legendary in the industry, innovations, technology. If you basically played an adventure game in the 80s or 90s, well, you know them. King's Quest, Leisure Suit Larry, Police Quest, Space Quest, Quest for Glory, or Hero's Quest if you still have the original copy of the first game like I do, and so on and so forth. Welcome to the show, Ken Williams.
Well, thank you. And it was funny hearing the word Quest so many times, Roberta, lately, because we've seen some new games coming out in modern era that use the word Quest. And she was saying, I started that. I was the one that did that first. And now everybody kind of copies it. But so kind of cool to see some piece of what you did live on.
There's something timeless about adventure games. You've written a book. Not all fairy tales have happy endings. And you were kind enough to give me early access to it. I've read it. This is a fascinating read for anybody who wants to find out how a software company worked, and more specifically how Sierra worked as a company. And to understand that, I guess first we need to look a little bit at the foundations of the company. Can you walk us through, and I know it's a legendary story, a lot of listeners will have heard this before, but can you walk us through a brief history of how Sierra gets started? How is it that you and Roberta start a software company?
Yeah, it was a long time ago, 40 years ago. And I was working as a programmer on big IBM mainframe computers in Los Angeles, and hated LA, mostly because I was driving an hour plus each way back and forth to work in heavy traffic, and was kind of always thinking, how can I get out of here? Plus, LA at the time was kind of getting crummy, I guess you'd say, with smog and crime. And we kind of had this vision of moving to the woods and living happily ever after in the woods. And so I was always trying to, because in those days there were no computer jobs. Basically, if you wanted to be in computers, your options were LA or New York. So maybe Chicago, but there really was not much opportunity for me outside of LA. So I knew that in order to move to the woods and realize our dream, that we'd have to start a company. So I was constantly trying to think about a company I could start. And it happened to be the time when Radio Shack brought out we used to call it the Trash 80, the TRS-80 computer. And I kind of said, then Microsoft, which was really just kind of, Gates and Paul Allen in those days. Yeah, and they did BASIC for the TRS-80, and I said, I could do that. Why don't I program Fortran for because I had been into compiler development and considered that kind of like the best possible form of programming to develop a compiler. And so I kind of started to work on a Fortran compiler. And Roberta, almost immediately, it was Christmas of 1979, and she bought me an Apple II. And I just thought I was in heaven because, suddenly it had so much more memory than the TRS-80 and a much faster processor. And I thought it was going to be, a happy time. And then they came out with a floppy disk drive, and that made life even better. And so I was happily coding up my Fortran compiler when I brought home from I did a lot of contract programming in those days for everybody in LA. And I was working on some project, and they had a teletype machine. And this literally was one that had a paper tape reader and would, what did it do? It would type out like one letter at a time or something. And I was connected to a computer at MIT. And I was goofing around, and I said, let's see if there's any games. And I found a game called Colossal Cave. And, it had that famous start where it says you're standing in front of a well. And I didn't know what to do. And I'm not much of a gamer, but I was typing around, and I managed to say go well or go north or something. And it changed what it said. And I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. So I went and found Roberta and say, hey, check this out. And then suddenly she wouldn't give me my toy back. She was addicted. So she sat there and played that. And I swear she played all night. But she says she actually kind of took about a month to beat the thing. And when she finished it, she said, well, she wanted more. So we found a guy named Scott Adams with Adventure International, had done some adventure games on audio cassette, and we loaded those up. And it might have been floppy, but I remember his audio cassette. And we finished his games, and Roberta wanted more, but then she suddenly had an idea to create her own game, and she told me about it, and I said no. I was busy. I said, let me get Fortran done first, and then we'll talk. And and she's stubborn. So she took me to dinner and begged me to write her game. And it's kind of a famous story because they're in this restaurant, and she's spreading out paper with little bubbles representing locations. And she's, she gets excited when she talks. She waves her arms and gets real animated, and she's making stabbing motions and talking about ice picks in eyes and freaking out people around us in the restaurant. So we went home, and she kept making her pitch. And I developed a mystery house for her game, based on, some extent. It's funny because the company kind of started because of me being lazy. Because rather than me coding her game, I wanted to build tools that would allow her to build her game and leave me alone so that I could go back to my compiler. So instead of just coding up a game for her, I gave her tools with which she could describe the vocabulary of the game, the locations of the game, the objects that were used to interact with other characters, the text that would be issued. And she sketched all that out on... in effect, what was spreadsheets, because I had to create. There was nothing then. I mean, there was no text editors. There was zero. So I had to write all the little utilities for her, but I give her a way to type in all of that information without bugging me, and that kind of left me alone so that I could work on what I called the interpreter to interpret all the stuff she did and put the game on the screen. And and then the big innovation was. That I said, gosh, wouldn't it be cool if there were pictures? And her eyes lit up and said, can you do that? And I started thinking about how. And the problem, obviously, was a lack of memory and a lack of graphics. And but then I had the idea of, I didn't know about vector art at that time. And I don't know if many people did outside of universities or something. But I kind of had the idea of just, doing endpoints of lines in order to get pictures compressed. And there wasn't much room on the floppy disks, I think it was 80K, something like that. And if you can imagine trying to cram, 100 pictures into 80K, you haven't got a lot of room to do anything. Well, plus, it's so long I don't remember, but I think the operating system was on floppy, or big pieces of it. So I had the operating system, I had my interpreter, I had all her data and the pictures, and I had to fit it on a floppy. So I had to be a little creative. But the final part of the story is that when I went into computer stores, and there weren't a lot of them, there were like 8 in California at the time, or 8 in the nation. I remember it was like nothing. And I showed off to a store in Northridge my game that was under development, and I showed them kind of the start of my Fortran compiler, and their eyes glazed over on Fortran but lit up for Mystery House. And suddenly people in the store were all crowding around the computer, and that was kind of the first clue that maybe I should take it more serious. And I don't know if that answers the question, but there it is.
That does answer the question quite well, and it kind of brings us in because I found a few of the original ads, and you also have them in the book. And again, wonderful plug for the book because there's a beautiful collection of images in there that kind of sets a lot of the stuff in its place, in time and so forth. You start selling Mystery House. There's a couple of other little shooting game or something as well in there. But very quickly, there's also an ad for certain utilities. I'm guessing it's the vector drawing program that you created for Mystery House and so forth. What was the idea or philosophy or plan there? Was it just, I have the code, let's sell it? Or did you think of the ramifications, or were there any ramifications? What was the thought process there?
I don't know. Well, I mean, clearly the thought process was, hey, I can make money here. We we wanted to live in the woods, and we did move up to Yosemite, but it was a little spooky to quit your job and move to a place where there are no other jobs. And I mean, I suppose if it hadn't worked out, I could have moved back to LA, but we didn't want to do that. So I was plus I was just in general, I'd call myself a greedy person, in that, and it's not so much, the greed as much as success. If you're going to do something, you want to do it right. If you're going to, whatever it is, you want to do it the best. And so I was hungry, I guess you'd say. And I had the utilities I'd written. I think that was called Paddle Graphics or something weird like that, and sold that. And then a buddy of mine I'd worked with at a company in LA wrote Skeet Shoot and Trap Shoot, and then another guy wrote Crossfire. And magically I was a software publisher. And it was because in a way, I mean, those other games, since they were already developed, all I had to do was sell them. I mean, there was no incremental cost to me, and yet I could make 10 or $12 per copy sold. And there wasn't that many outlets for computer software in those days, so I needed more than one product. If you're going to call on a store to sell them one game, is tough to break even on. But if you can sell them 10 different games, and all of a sudden, out of that same phone call, you've got a nice profit going. So it worked.
And that is an idea that I think we need to get back to a few times, the idea of building up a catalog of software. But before I guess going into that, for those who weren't there, and I'll admit my first computer purchase isn't until 1985, so I missed out on those first years. What was the industry like at that time? What were the avenues for selling? I mean, you had the direct calling to the handful of shops that existed. You also had some computer fairs going on and so forth. What is the industry side of it? What does it look like? Who are the players? What are the relationships like between developers, publishers, hardware manufacturers, and so forth?
Well, I mean, over the first 5 years, kind of from 1980 to 85, I think it was all kind of evolving. There was, really kind of mom-pop computer stores that fired up to sell hardware, and software. Was obviously you needed software to sell the machines, but most of the people that were buying the computers in those days were hackers. I mean, it wasn't really on computer market. People weren't buying computers to take home for their kids because there was no game. So it was people who were interested in computers and wanted to learn to program, or just wanted to hack away at them. So it was, it was a different dynamic, and the computer stores were really fired up with people that were themselves passionate about computers. And when you walked into a computer store, it would typically be the owner that was there, and it was somebody that loved computers and probably could put one together themselves, and you could talk to them about keyboards, and there were no mice. There was no, even floppy disks were new, and most people didn't have them in those days. So there was no concept of distribution, and there was really no distribution channel, and there was no concept of competitors, because there was kind of no market. I mean, it was really more people started building software and suddenly realized there was money to be made, and the industry was born. In fact, I sold a buddy of mine because I started actually selling for some of our, I guess you'd call them competitors, like Scott Adams International. And I called and said, hey, as long as I'm calling these stores, can I sell your stuff? And I started selling for him too. And then suddenly it became a distributor. I remember thinking, I had to work out what discount does a retailer get, what discount am I going to give a distributor so that everybody can make money. And for a decade at the beginning of the business, when I first set up to sell to distribution for 55% and sell retailers at 40% off, that discount structure ran for probably the first 5-10 years of the industry, and it kind of grew out of what Sierra did at the beginning. So, but anyway, so I sold the distribution piece to a buddy of mine because at some point I recognized that there was a difference between a distributor and a software developer. And I thought that if you get a focused, I thought that what I should probably focus on was publishing software and developing software. And so that's where we specialized. And sorry to meander. I hope that answers.
No. This is actually really good. What were some of the difficulties or this decision to get out of the publishing business? What particular difficulties? Out of distribution. Sorry, my bad. Yeah. So what particular difficulties were you having that made it less attractive than trying to do both functions at the same time?
Yeah, I don't remember. I just remember not enough hours in a day and also thin margin. In distribution, there's a lot of physical work with packing boxes and billing people and collecting money. And I really wanted more. I got excited about software. I didn't get excited about bureaucracy, the idea of shipping boxes and billing people. And it was starting to take over my life, that end of the business. And I wanted out of talking to individual computer stores and talking to other competitors about marketing their products. It seemed like a lot of work for a thin margin. But when I sold that company, the guy that took it over for me turned it into a $1 billion business. So maybe I picked the wrong side of it. I had a bigger car today. But, oh well.
You didn't do too bad. You didn't do too bad.
I did okay. It turned out good, at least for me.
Yeah. Now, in this atmosphere, what was the role of things like the West Coast Computer Fair and events like that?
Well, it was a chance to show our games to individual retailers. A lot of the purchase decision was still made by mom-pop computer stores. So it was kind of a convenient time. I mean, it grew over the years, and the way you would use those shows changed. But in the very beginning, it was kind of convenient because everybody was there. You could take them to a booth, you could show them the games, and talk to them, and negotiate and work out sales. And also, it was kind of a party. It was a chance to meet everybody else in the industry and go out to dinner and go out carousing. And so I always look forward to those shows because everybody could hang out and have a good time, and you could get business done. So it all worked perfect. And that's for that Al Lowe. I heard that you interviewed him.
Yes.
And, he was a school teacher teaching band, and his wife taught band. And he stumbled up to me with a couple of games he had written. And it's funny that the guy who wrote Leisure Suit Larry started with me by selling me on a game that he'd written in BASIC called Bop-A-Bet, and another one, which I forget the name
Dragon's Keep.
Dragon's Keep, that's right. That goes way back. But Al wrote those, and even then you could sense his personality and that he has a sense of humor. And out of all the Sierra days, Al's the only one I keep regular touch with. We play golf like every week when I'm in Seattle, and he always beat me for years. And lately, I've gotten lucky against him, so it's working out.
Yeah, no, talking to him was an absolute pleasure. And well, we talked about it briefly before. Leisure Suit Larry was my gateway to the Sierra Adventures, and very important part of my youth.
Very fun.
So. Now, you said that it was a good time. You could get to know a lot of people. What were the relationships like between software developers at that time? What was Was there a feeling of, hey, we're all in this together, it's a small, scrappy industry? Was there, oh, look what this guy is doing, oh no, we've got to up our game? What was that atmosphere like?
Well, it was more, the market was hungrier for product than any of us could produce. There was no sense of, if I grow market share, your market share has to shrink. In the 80s, the market was way bigger than any of us could have delivered. And plus, everybody kind of had their own little niche in the market. Yeah, but in the beginning, it was, Bill Staley from a company called Mindscape, and Jerry Jewell from Sirius Software, and Scott Adams and me and Doug Carlston from Broderbund. And we'd all hook up at the shows, and Dave Gordon from Program International. I mean, it was kind of a fun time where everybody was kind of feeling their way in this new business and just, kind of enjoying each other's company. There was no sense of competition. I don't really remember ever feeling like it was a tough business until we started getting into the 90s. I mean, it was really kind of kind of fun. Just fun shipping products. Although I would say I was one of the first ones to start really sensing competition and realizing that you had to either keep up and grow or you were going to die. And it was easy to do that. Once things started maturing and tightening up, then suddenly, it was serious time. And you had to really realize that if you didn't do things exactly right, then you weren't going to make it. So,
what were the relationships, or how was there a relationship between software manufacturers and hardware manufacturers at that time?
No, there wasn't. I mean, there was and there wasn't. Some of the software publishers worked closely with the hardware companies, and some didn't. And in my case, I was always kind of frustrated by the machines themselves, and I would annoy them as much as I could by trying to be in their face, saying, what are you going to do about making it easier to install programs? When are you going to give us more colors? When are you going to give us a sound card? And and I remember talking to Apple about sound, talking to Wozniak and Jobs back in the very early days, and them explaining that they had litigation at the time. I think the Beatles owned the name Apple, and they were barred from doing music. And obviously they straightened it out, because Apples do music these days. But it was a different time then. But I tried to stay in touch with the hardware companies, because I kind of had this vision for what I thought a game should look like. And there was always kind of a side of me that when people would say our games are awesome, I'd look at them and say, this is crap. If I saw this, if I went to the movie theater and I saw this on screen, and there's this little 12 pixel wide guy kind of roboting his way around the screen, I'm not going to watch the rest of that movie. It's so I kind of had this vision in my mind for what I thought a game should look like. And that's not what they look like. And yet everybody kept telling me we were doing great things, but I knew that was going to run out of gas. It was kind of like if the industry had stayed there, then as soon as the novelty wore off, I was going to be out of business and have to move back to LA and sit in traffic again. And that wasn't going to happen. So I did, I maintained close contact with the hardware companies, and, like Roland, and even AdLib. I wish I could remember how it happened, but I remember pushing them to do the sound card, and we wrote the drivers for it. And then I went to Roland and talked them into doing the MT32. And part of a whole debate that was going on there that Sierra kind of led, where it wasn't clear if we were going to do MIDI standard for the music, or do just standard recorded music, or like the MT32, where we were talking to it with MIDI, but the music was coming out of another device external. So that whole music end and graphics end and user interface end was a big deal for me, because I wanted the industry where it is today, but the problem is now I'm out of it, is the depressing part. So, I was just looking at a video of Microsoft Flight Simulator, And on the left, they had Flight Simulator. On the right, they had real footage taken out the window. And you just can't tell the difference. I mean, what a difference a few decades makes. It's pretty awesome now. Wish I was in it. True. Not anymore.
The hardware race, especially on DOS machines, that's definitely something we need to talk about. But I want to stay in the early 80s for just a minute longer.
Sure.
Now, Sierra was a champion of the Apple II platform in many ways. Yeah. That's the system that is most closely associated with Sierra in those early days. Was this just because that's the system you guys started with, or was there a particular affinity or technical reason to go with the Apple at that time?
No, it was kind of the only game in town. I mean, the PC wasn't launched until we were like 4 or 5 years old, and the original IBM PC was not marketed at all to homes. So Apple pretty much had the market to themselves. The COM64 came along, the Atari 400 and 800, but I think they were, probably at least 5 or 6 years after the Apple II. And so, although I'd have to look back, but yeah, I remember that they didn't come out until later, and I loved them. I mean, at first, we really jumped on the bandwagon with the Atari and COM64 because they were great machines. So, I mean, it wasn't really that we liked Apple or loved Apple or could only develop for Apple. It was just the only game in town. It's what we kind of got known for. And we were kind of Apple-centric. We had a house with a racquetball court in it, and I had an Apple logo on the floor of the racquetball court. And I even saw that house is for sale. We have dark crystal stained glass in the windows. And
oh, really?
Yeah, it's if you dig around on the internet, you'll see it. And it was a cool house, but it says something about our mentality, which is we were pretty Apple-centric in the early days, and that kind of changed when Apple went the direction of the Mac, because at first the Mac was black and white, and whereas on the PC, suddenly you got the Tandy 1000 and other 6502-based computers like the COM64 and the Atari 800, and we could do those. And so, yeah, we kind of shifted away from Apple more toward the PC, but it was because the hardware left us, not because our allegiance changed. And all of a sudden on Mac, I mean, it wasn't really a great game platform. So,
gotcha.
We shifted more toward Windows. And and I was kind of disappointed to do that, although ultimately, the game sold, so that's what counted. That was my reminder that we had this.
You start off with the adventure games. Mystery House begets the entire line of the high-res adventures. And then there's a diversification. 82, 83, there's more action games coming in. We get, obviously, the lawsuit with Atari comes out of all of this. Now, how did the decision process internally work to diversify the portfolio of games, especially since you said that, each company sort of had their niche? What was it like to make the decision, we're going to invest resources in developing a different type of product? How were those decisions made?
Well, at the beginning, I wouldn't say there was a lot of product strategy. It was more, if I could get the game, I would sell the game. And if you look at those first years, I mean, we had like the 6502 assembler we sold. We had graphic utilities. We had action games. We were kind of all over the map, and there was no clear strategy. And it was because it kind of flowed from the guys that were working for us, or that I would happen to see. If I was at a computer show and I saw a game and it looked cool, I would immediately want to sign it and sell it. And there was no big picture strategy. Over time, I got one. And literally would track market share by category every month. But that evolved much later. In the early days, it was really a matter of stumbling through the show, or talking to somebody, or one of my programmers wandering into my office and saying, "Hey, I think I could do a cool game." And Yeah, so I wish I could claim I knew something in those days, but it was really just that looks cool. I want to sell it, and I think people will buy it.
Gotcha. Like you said with Al Lowe, and like you just mentioned, a lot of the product, or not a lot, but some of the product was coming in from stuff that you saw at shows. Did people submit programs to Sierra for publishing?
Yeah, people would actually mail us floppies. And in the early days, I would look at that, but most of it was garbage. I mean, it's really pretty. I bet I opened 1,000 products, and I don't know that I can remember one that I shipped from the mail other than soft porn. I think that literally came with Chuck Denton mailing me a floppy and saying, "Would you like to market this?" But as I think back on it, it's probably the only one that I ever published from outside. Well, until Half-Life, that wound up being something published completely from the outside. But in the early days, in fact, I had somebody that worked for me whose job it was to open those, put them up on the computer, and see if there was anything cool. And there just never was. I mean, It's too bad because, like in the book, I actually encourage people to sit down and write something, but it's tough. Yeah, I mean, if you haven't got the right talent, you're not going to build something great. So.
And I guess we do have to talk about soft porn because, well, it's just one of those topics that always comes up.
Fun.
The famous, infamous, absolutely effective cover image for soft porn. And obviously Sierra at this point is doing adventure games. You have educational software in the lineup and so forth. Was any thought given to any negative blowback that might come from that? The suggestion, we all know soft porn itself, there's not a lot of really raunchy stuff in there, but just from the suggestion of it.
Well, we shipped it first with kind of a texty, kind of ugly looking front cover. And it sold, but not that great. And then I had the idea, or maybe John, my brother, did. I don't remember who had the idea to go shoot the picture in the hot tub. And suddenly we did it. And it's funny because, I mean, it was how the world was in those days. I mean, it was the early 80s, and we were all kind of children of the 70s, I guess you'd say. And if you go into an office and say, hey, let's go over to Ken's house and shoot pictures in a hot tub, I mean, that's like automatic, that's not, you don't have to agonize over that thought. Plus, I knew even then that since Roberta was so famous, having her be in the hot tub with the girls was going to sell an awful lot. And we're in an entertainment business, for lack of a word. I mean, it's, what sells, and there's nothing wrong with free publicity. And that's when it hit the big time. Because that picture got in Time magazine, and Time magazine was a much bigger, I guess, magazine in those days than it is now. And that created a huge wave of press and really kind of put us on the map. That game, bad as it was, although it's a funny game, it's an incredibly good text adventure. But the world had moved past text adventures, and I do think it was the courage to ship the game with that cover or whatever that got us all the press. And so then we went back out and we redid the game as Leisure Suit Larry with graphics and don't cover. But we were already on the map at that point. We had definitely grabbed people's attention. So.
Gotcha. And since we're on the topic of packaging and so forth, we're still in the sort of pre-crash days. How did manufacturing of the product work? I mean, obviously in the very early days, it's Ziploc baggies and so forth. But once you have to get into boxes and photo printing and so forth, what was that like? Did you contact printers and say, hey, I want to do this for a software package? And did they just look at you like, well, what's a software package? Or how did that work?
Yeah. Well, it was just a weird twist of fate that when we went looking for an office, for our very first office in Oakhurst, by coincidence, we rented an office upstairs above a print shop. And it was a print shop, like a real print shop. I mean, they had a monster press, and they were doing work for people around the country. And the guy that ran it, named, what was it, Cleon Jones, was kind of a personality. And he rented to us, not even knowing what we did. And I just kind of stumbled down the stairs one day and said, could you print this for us? And I think it was the wrapper for our football game. We did a football game called High Res Football, and we had done kind of a racy picture for it, and of cheerleaders and stuff. Not proud of that one, but it was a little too racy. And but Cleon printed them up, and then we looked at it. We go, no, we can't do this. And we did a different cover for it. So if any of those were ever around, that'd be a find. But he printed that, and he did a great job. And then he printed something else, and he printed something else, and he wound up printing all of our boxes. And I think he printed for us maybe all the way to the end. I mean, it started with him being 100% of our printing, and by the end, he was probably 2%. But even that was enough to keep him more than on overload. It was, it was just good. So, I mean, what he would do, he would print the boxes, and we literally had a group that would take the box and would take the manual and copy the discs, and it was quite an operation. I mean, at the end, we probably had 600 or 700 people in manufacturing copying the discs. Although we didn't copy. Actually, I don't remember how we copied discs in the final days. I assume we outsourced the actual duplicating of the CDs, but maybe not. So I don't remember how they happened. Probably had machines that popped them out. Yeah. So, and I remember the production line because it was always cool. Even in the early days, the line didn't change. It just got bigger and with more modern equipment. But, you'd have people there as a manual process to take the disc, take the sleeve, take the instruction manual, take the box. And we got fancy with boxes over the years. I think we did one box for like Black Cauldron or something where we used to call it like the pop front box, where you could open the box and on the outside was the instruction manual in color. Because it was a different world. I mean, product was sold at retail stores, and you wanted people to kind of pick it up and open the thing and start reading, and that would be what would get them to buy. These days it's all about, a YouTube video and, who pays for positioning on Steam or something, but different world.
So. Definitely. And yes, the box for Black Cauldron is a very, very nice box. I still have my copy.
We took the money on that one. That turned out good, though.
Yeah,
I'm not sure what other ones we did the pop front box, but we did a bunch. Yeah, there for a while. It was kind of a popular thing to do.
It's in these early days that the venture capital comes into play. How did that happen? Did you go looking for venture capital for the company, or did it come looking for you?
Well, quick answer is it came looking for us. I was pretty, I knew a little bit about finance and had studied for accounting when I was young. And in my work in Los Angeles, I worked for a company called Financial Decision Systems doing a spreadsheet. When I first saw VisiCalc, I said, oh, they copied my software. But I was kind of depressed. Yeah, and then Lotus 1, 2, 3 and some of those products. But the beginning of that was a spreadsheet I did for General Motors and a couple other big companies so that they could do their tax return. And we'd do like 50 of those for the 50 states. But, what were we talking about? Now I lost my train of thought.
Venture capital coming at you.
Venture capital. Yeah, but I'd never thought about the stock market, really, and how all that worked. And I get a call one day from some lady out of Boston who said she was a venture capitalist and wanted to come talk to me. And out of it could come that she'd give me some money and buy some stock in my company. And none of that made sense. And we were up in Oakhurst. And she showed up, very elegant lady. And we went to lunch. And she asked about the company. But almost immediately she said, I'll give you $1 million and you give me 20% of your company. And it sounded too good to be true. And I kept asking her, what the catches were. And she said none, that she would go on our board, and we'd have to form a board, but it was going to be Roberta and me and her. So it wasn't exactly like she was going to outvote us. And she said she wasn't going to like take an office and come to work every day. She was just going to give me the $1 million. And we didn't need the money. And I don't think we ever actually spent it. It kind of went into the account. I mean, years later, some bad stuff happened, and we wound up spending every dime we had and a lot more. But, for years there, we ran cash positive and everything was pretty great. Yeah, but she bought 20% of the company. We kind of had to clean up our act. That was what forced the transition from online systems to Sierra Online, because we had a conflict on the company name. And prior to when we took the venture capital, we ran out of Roberta's and my checking account. We paid people with our personal checks. So suddenly, but she helped with all that. She hooked us up with lawyers and helped us get incorporated and form stock. And Roberta at the time didn't like it. It smelled fishy to her. She couldn't believe they were going to do this. And so she kind of fought it. But I said, well, this is free money. We should take it. And we did. And Roberta, as always, was right. So venture capital wound up being kind of a headache for us later. So.
Gotcha. Now, obviously, we're still in that pre-crash period. There's one incident or one relationship here that I do want to ask about, because it's always been something that's a little curious for me, which was Sierra working with Richard Garriott. Because you do talk about him in the book, and I think you phrase it as the only person who ever outsmarted you in a negotiation.
Yeah.
Okay, I need to know the story. So how did that come about?
Garriott's quite a personality. He's just a smart guy. Most people are either creative or they're technical or they're, I don't know, a bureaucrat and organized and people fall into slots, but not Garriott. He's really kind of everything. I mean, he's technical, he's creative, he's a marketer, he's a product guy. I mean, he's kind of an unusual duck and kind of good. When I met him, he had been publishing a game called Calibeth with, I think it was called Cal Pacific Computing. And he wasn't happy with them and wanted to know if we'd publish his game. And normally I wouldn't publish something if we didn't own the trademark or copyright. And I think he somehow convinced me, well, let's try this out, like dating before we get married and market this game. And that sounded good to me. I like that idea. You could try us and we could try him and see how the chemistry was. And we put together Ultima, but then he put all these crazy rules in place. He wanted me to do this map, and we printed it, and it wasn't good enough quality for him, and he had kind of say over what it was like. And somehow what I thought it'd be, like a printed map on a piece of paper became a $10 map or $12 map printed in Pakistan or someplace crazy. And so that introduced delays, waiting for the map, getting the color just right on it, throwing away the ones that didn't look right. He dictated the box. He was, and to his credit, I mean, he had a sense of quality and what he wanted to deliver to the customer. And I'm never going to fault somebody for that. But I can't say I got rich on publishing the game Ultima 2. And we did some follow-ons on it. And, I didn't remember why we kind of came apart. But I read his book recently. And I think he didn't like kind of the party atmosphere at Sierra. And there was. I mean, at that point, that was kind of in the area when Steve Levy wrote the era where Steve Levy wrote his book called Hackers. And we were having a lot of, I wouldn't say problems internally. We were kids with way too much money and too little common sense. And Steve and Richard didn't. Well, plus Richard was good enough. He could be his own publisher. I mean, he had a recognized name. He had a recognized product. He wanted me to do what he was calling Multima, an online multiplayer online game. And he wanted, $1 million or $2 million or something in advances for it. and I didn't want to pay that much money. And so it just came time to part company, for all of those reasons. And it's too bad. I would have loved to have worked with him forever, despite not getting rich on it, because he is a great guy, and I wanted the product. So, and it was great. I mean, it was an honor to have ever published Ultima. It was a pretty cool product for the time. So,
gotcha. Okay, and thank you, because that was always a story that I never quite could put the pieces together on. We do have to talk about the crash, and normally when we talk about the video game crash, we're talking about the console market collapsing, but the computer market was pretty much untouched by it. But obviously Sierra does get hit by it. How did that transition from computer software publisher to console game publisher happen for Sierra? What happened there?
Well, we blame the venture capitalists, but I'm as guilty as anybody. The video game market was taken off, and the computer market for games was tiny. And the computers in those days didn't really have great sound, didn't really have great graphics. They had no hardware assist. So like simple things like scrolling the screen or collision detect had to be done in software on fairly clunky processors. Meanwhile, there were machines like the TI-99 came along, and the Atari 400 and 800 and the COM64. And in those days, they took cartridges. Oh, and they had the Coktel Vision. And there was a lot and even the Atari 2600. And we could recognize that we were, a big fish in a tiny pond. And the pond wasn't going to go anywhere. And that if you saw it from my perspective, I was looking at these clunky graphics and this archaic hardware and saying, you just can't do a fun game on this. We need something, we need a better machine. And these other machines could do things better. Plus, I liked the idea of the cartridges because you just plug the thing in and the game would run. Whereas, I remember talking to Microsoft in the early days about the install program, and I talked to one of Bill Gates' lieutenants and said, go ask Gates if his mom can install any one of our products. You pick it, or pick one of his products. And if they can do it, then then we got nothing to talk about. But if they can't, call me, because the install programs are killing the business. And because in those days, there were so many decisions you had to make to install a product and get it running. It just wasn't mass market. I could see why the video game market was taken off. And so we basically shut down all the development for the Apple II, and instead kind of shifted gears to building cartridges. We even fired up, I was talking to the guys that made like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and we were doing a game for the 2600 for it. But that way, we did Crossfire. We did almost every action game we ever did for cartridge market. And the problem with the cartridge market is that you have to take big inventory, and so you're taking a lot of risk. Literally, you can't make a cartridge. In those, I don't know what the market's like today for cartridges, but I bet it works about the same way, which was, you got to get permission, you got to get approved to do the game, and then you have to send the game off to the Nintendo or Coleco or whoever it was and get their permission to release it. And then you have to pay them to manufacture the cartridges. So I was having to go to Commodore or Atari and say, you make my cartridges and I'll pay you $18 a piece, and I'll take 10,000. So, suddenly there goes 180 grand out the door. And that's after you got to pay to program it. And then you got to wait for another 3 months or something for them to manufacture it. So you got somebody else standing on your critical path. You got to write big checks. You got to take the inventory. Then you got to package it up and hope you can sell it. And that would have been fine if the market had been normal, but it didn't. It was, kind of inconceivable today, but for whatever reason, video games became unhip one day. It was like one day everybody had to have one. Everybody loved them, and they just all of a sudden one day, They just, you'd have been embarrassed to be seen playing a video game machine. And I don't really understand kind of how that happened. But, it was like a pack mentality, and the pack represented the entire world. And we got caught with warehouses full of cartridges, and cartridges still on order that were still coming in. And
Oh, wow.
all of a sudden, we were going fine. And one day, kind of the world ended, and we had, I think at the time, 130 employees, and we had no money. So we, decided, we picked a couple of computer projects and kept them going, and fired everybody else. I mean, there was one day we laid off over 100 people out of 130. And that was traumatic for me because it was the first time that I kind of recognized this was a business and you could really lose money if you weren't smart. Before the, and venture capitalists, it's funny how they're in one of two modes. They're either forcing you to take money or you can't get it if your life depends on it. And they don't remember that you were a hero last week. I mean, if Elon Musk ever stumbles a week later, they'll all call him an idiot. Nobody will write him a check. But, for right now, probably they're all standing in line to give him money. So it's you're either a hero or a goat in their eyes. And the same venture capitalists that I just always figured would be backing us up and that there would be money there if I needed it, that money wasn't there anymore. And yet we had this high burn rate, and we had warehouses full of useless cartridges, and the world kind of ended. So, but we came back, obviously, but that was a bad day. So.
I'll believe it. Now, and I talked to Al Lowe, and the way he describes it is that basically everybody got the walking papers. A handful of people got freelance contracts to continue to work on projects. Now, was this, number one, is that correct recollection on it? And number two, was this the birth of the royalty fee collecting designer model of Sierra, or did that pre-exist in some form before that already?
I don't know. I was paying royalties to people, like, obviously Richard Garriott would have got royalties. Work Wygant, who wrote like our very first game, would have got royalties on each game sold. So now I was already paying royalties to people, and there were people like Chuck Benton who did soft porn, who got a couple bucks every time one sold. So now I think we were from the beginning pretty much in the paying royalties business. And but at that point, I was just trying to keep the company afloat, and I couldn't pay people paychecks. Some I could, but not many. And so like even Al Lowe, I called him and said, why don't you be my programming manager? I think I made him the programming manager. And I was going to give him a piece of the action on some product. And I don't even remember what product, but, I think it's possible with some people, I just said, work free. Let me figure out how to get us going again. And if I do, then you got a job. And if I don't, then you're no worse off than you are today. So there were people that were working free. And Roberta and I got lucky in that it was a small town, and we were able to convince the local bank to lend on our house, which in a way they took quite a risk because we were the town's biggest employer. And, if our house would have been completely unmarketable had the company not made it. So I don't know who would have bought it, and the bank would have been out. But the bank lent us money, and we maxed out our credit cards. And probably of the 30 people that stayed, probably 5 or 10 were working for free. Roberta took over a lot of functions. She was our accounting department for a long time after that. And she was doing, it wasn't even accounting department, because the accounting department, you got accounts receivable and accounts payable. We only had accounts payable. So she was responsible for calling vendors and pleading with them to not force us into bankruptcy and work out payment programs. We offered, it's a crazy one, that we had a new building being built, a big, beautiful building. And the couple that owned it, I called up, they were entrepreneurs. They had built this building for this young growing software company. And I said, why don't you take 10% of Sierra and forgive, like the next 6 months for the rent? And that would have been worth $100 million or something if they'd taken the deal, but they said no. And I bet they kicked themselves for that one. We paid the rent and we paid past due money on it and everything else, which was depressing. But as I mentioned, we turned it around pretty quickly, but through luck. I mean, some things in life, there's a lot that I'd love to take credit for and a lot that I deserve credit for, but there's also a lot that was just being in the right place at the right time. And we got lucky. I mean, IBM happened to call about that time and was looking for, some game to show off this new machine they had coming out called the Peanut, which turned out to be called the PC Junior later. And I hope I am not in trouble with IBM for giving away their code name. And I don't know if everybody had that code name or just us, but they called it the Peanut to us. And they were willing to give us development advances against product for that machine. And they were willing to write really big checks for royalty advances for us to produce software for their new machine. So suddenly the focus for me shifted from, how do I get IBM up from one product they're asking us to do to, 5 or 10, so I can get a lot more of those advances and hire people back. And I don't remember how fast it was. It seems like it was weeks, but it was probably a couple months until I got money from IBM and could hire back most of the people that we laid off, and we were back in business. So it was really kind of a short period, but it was one of those, when you wake up one morning, you have to lay off 100 people. It's traumatic. I mean, it's one of those things you never forget for the rest of your life. And, I was stressed out. I mean, that was killing me. So I was, it wasn't so much that it bothered me personally because, I'd come out of LA where I knew that not only could I get a job in minutes, I could work for 20 companies in minutes, but that was me. I mean, all these other people, though, had moved their families to the woods, and they were up the creek if the company didn't make it. So it was an ugly moment, and I would say it transitioned me personally and really everybody at the company from being a bunch of renegade hippies up in the woods making software to being employees of a software company that was going to be run as a business from that day forward. So,
gotcha. And the relationship with IBM and the development of what the game that would become King's Quest. Now, what brought IBM to you? What was the connection there?
Yeah, they were already kind of connected with us in that they had been working on their IBM PC for the business market on a new graphics card that was going to be called the EGA card. Before then, they'd had the CGA card, and the EGA card was allegedly a big step up in that it could do more than black and white. And they wanted some game to show off their fancy EGA card. And so they had come to us and asked us if they could take our Wizard and Princess game and if we would modify it for their IBM PC. And so we did that, and they launched it. We had no control over what happened to it, but we did a custom version of Wizard and the Princess under the name Adventures in Serenia for them. And they were selling it. And it wasn't selling great, but it was really the only game for the IBM PC. And they did this horrible, ugly gray packaging that was on the game. And
you have a picture of it in the book. When I saw that, I was just, I thought, okay, is this an accounting program? I mean, it was just terrible.
Yeah, when I first saw that, I assumed they had some color wraparound or something on it. But no, that was it. They just shrunk wrap it and stuck it up on a shelf.
Oh,
so
Jesus.
It was IBM. I mean, IBM, it's funny because now, I mean, Roberta will say to me, what does IBM do? Are they still in business? And I look it up, they're still a multi-billion-dollar company, so they do something. But even me as a geek, I can't really tell you what it is these days. I don't think they're making, actually, I don't think mainframe computers exist anymore, those big room-size computers. Yeah, the world's I mean, probably if you go to AWS, you see lots of little bitty PCs that are there. So it's a different world. But yeah, IBM was selling it, so they had a relationship with us, and they kind of considered us their game company. And so they came back to us and said, "Okay, we're doing this other new machine called the Peanut, and why don't you do Adventures in Serenia, the renamed Wizard and Apprentice for the Peanut?" And Roberta, meanwhile, was when I asked her to do it, she said, "Tell me about the machine." And I position it as this incredibly powerful beast. And she got excited and she said, "Well, can it do animation?" And I said, "Well, yeah, sure." And I had no idea if it could or not, but I said that. And so we kind of put people together because she didn't really just want to do Wizard and Princess over again. She was excited about the idea of having a little character walking around and doing animation. And so I kind of worked with, I think it was Jeff Stevenson and Bob Heitman, a couple of our programmers. And we put together a example of what it could look like. And I flew back to Boca Raton, Florida, and showed it to IBM. And they got super excited about it. And then I was able to leverage that into not doing just one game, but probably 5 or 6 games for the PC Junior. And we built, as part of that, the infrastructure to be able to do an animated adventure game. So all of that, we were divided internally into a few different groups. We had a tools group because in those days there was no. Today, if you want to build software, the big decision is which IDE do I use and which engine do I use. But there was none of that then. I mean, we had to build our own art and animation tools, our own music tools. So we had a tools group, and we had a interpreter group, and we had a compiler group. And then we had kind of an applications group that was building the games separate from the team that was actually working on the game. So there was a few different groups, and we built all of that for King's Quest. But once we had kind of that whole setup, we were able to do other games using that same engine. And the beauty is it was funded by IBM for the PC Junior. And the reason that we didn't die when the PC Junior died, because that would have been really bad, was that Tandy happened to be launching. They were trying to compete with IBM, and they launched something that was basically a PC Junior compatible or very similar. And I don't remember if we changed anything or if the software just ran. But it was basically, because we were interpretive based, we could make slight changes to the platform we were running on without affecting the underlying game. And when the PC Junior bombed, I went to Radio Shack and talked to a guy named John Roach, who was running the company at the time, and said, "Hey, I got all this cool software, and you've got this new machine coming out. Why don't you sell our software in your store?" And that worked out great because we suddenly had 6,000 retail outlets. They were trying to sell hardware, and our software was by far the first to support it. And and the PC Junior, as most people know, was not a big hit for IBM. It should have been. I think they were just worried about cannibalizing their business market for the IBM PC. And so they wanted to draw kind of a clear distinction between their home machine and their business machine. And customers really didn't want that. They wanted to think they had a real computer. And so the keyboard was especially bad for the PC Junior. They called it the chiclet keyboard. It was about like today's laptop keyboards, kind of a membrane keyboard, and it really sucked. So but that was it. I mean, that was really kind of our crash, and it wasn't that long-lived. But it was through the good fortune of IBM coming through the door and then Radio Shack coming through the door to turn us around. And then after that, it was all nothing but fun and growth. So
yeah. Now, those 5 games or so that IBM that you were contracted to create for IBM, did IBM just cancel those orders after the PC Junior crashed, or
Well,
What happened with that?
we have, I don't remember the contracts, but they would be something like, we'll give you, 750 grand spread over, 3 milestones, 250 up front, 250 when we see a working demo, 250 when we release. And that'll be against $1 a copy or $4 a copy. Yeah, I don't remember the deal, but it probably would have been something like that. And when the PC Junior came out, I mean, they still produced royalty statements, but there was no sales. Although probably what happened is that our royalty statements showed that there were sales, but not enough to recover our advances. So we never got, or I don't remember ever getting any actual royalties beyond the advances. But what worked for us was that our IBM at the time was under siege by the government as a monopoly. And they were reeling. I think the case was actually over at that time, and the government had backed off a little. But IBM had just gone through several years of litigation where they were afraid they were going to actually tear up the company, as happened to AT&T. And the government does that once in a while, and they see a monopoly. And they were after IBM, and IBM was super gun shy. So they from the beginning, I mean, it was the goofiest contract because we had to swear to them that we would not give them anything exclusively, and we wouldn't give them anything we weren't willing to offer to other people. And so, it was kind of like, we'll give you money and we'll sell your game, but you have to promise us you'll also sell it to other people. And okay, yeah, I can do that deal. And that worked out good. I mean, if we'd had an exclusive arrangement, we'd have been tanked again because when the PC Junior went down, we'd have never earned any money. And it also, I mean, somehow in that same time frame, we signed up with Disney, and Disney was super appealing to Radio Shack. And because we had our interpreter, we were able to quickly get all of our Disney products over onto Radio Shack. And we had this monstrous-sized pipeline into 6,000 Radio Shack stores. And it's hard to believe. I think Radio Shack's gone today. But we had this enormous pipeline to buy our products. And it was just perfect for us. So it put us kind of back on the map. And we never looked back after that. I mean, it was good times.
Mm. And the Disney products especially are quite interesting because the interpreter, the AGI interpreter, does get adapted so that you can create games on a variety of platforms. There's the Apple II, the Macintosh, I believe, gets a version later on. Obviously, you have the PC with DOS. Later on, a couple of years later, you get the Amiga and the Atari ST. Now, in the U.S. market, around this time, a lot of people would say the predominant home computer, especially for games, was the Commodore 64. Curiously enough, the AGI interpreter never gets converted to the C64. Was there a technical reason for this, or was it a financial decision? What was the reason for that?
Huh, I thought it did. Are you sure? Was the COM64 limited, or? Yeah, I don't know. I can't imagine why we wouldn't have done it. Should have been a natural for us. It was the whole reason we were interpreter based was to quickly move things to other platforms. And there's got to be some technical reason why we didn't, but I can't envision what it would have been.
The only technical reason I can imagine is that the Commodore 64's basic graphic mode didn't have square pixels. It had elongated pixels.
Boy,
so that may have messed up the graphics.
I mean, I can't. I mean, maybe the 64 was slow enough that, God, I mean, if we did them on the Apple II and the 64 was faster than the Apple II. So I guess the answer is probably somebody knows, but not me. I just don't remember. It might just be that once we transitioned into IBM, we were making enough money there that, and I probably was kind of mad at the 64 because we had made all those COM64 cartridges and had to bury them. And was it? No, I guess Jack Tramiel was Coleco.
No, Jack Tramiel was Commodore up until 84. Then he gets kicked out in 84, and then he buys up Atari. So he's actually running Atari when the ST is launched.
Okay.
Yeah,
I remember him. He was kind of a character. He used to go gambling in Vegas at shows and stuff. But Commodore was. I don't know. Yeah, I have to look back. I assume that there was some technical reason because all of that product would have rolled over pretty easy. So it was either that the machine wasn't fast enough, didn't have enough memory, or didn't have enough disk capacity. Something. I can't imagine we wouldn't have put the product there. So I don't know.
It was always something that surprised me because I didn't get to play Sierra games on my own machine until I got the Amiga years later, and so on the C64 I was limited to BC, the Johnny Hart games, and the Disney games. Those were the ones that we got. But yeah,
Disney was on AGI, so
but the C64 versions were completely reprogrammed. They look completely different on the C64.
I don't know. I guess you stumped me. So,
okay.
Sorry.
No problem. It's just one of those old questions. I thought I finally found it because Allo didn't know the answer either.
Now Roberta asked me about our first date, and I had to go ask her. She says, "You don't remember our first date?" I go, "No, I don't remember that." But, so some of the stuff in the book, I had to cheat and ask her. So.
Not a problem. Okay. So moving on, it's a couple years later, you guys go public with the stock. And you talk about this very eloquently and in great detail in the book, and I highly recommend people look it up. But just wanted to talk. So at the time that the company went public, what was your motivation to move the company to public status? Were there any market forces that made this a very attractive move at that moment? What was the thinking?
Well, I mean, it was to have public stock to acquire other companies with, and also to provide liquidity to our employees and our venture capitalists. I mean, from the day, any entrepreneur starts a company and you get venture capital, you start focusing on the public offering because there's only two end games at that point. I mean, either you run something, as a family business, and we weren't on track for that the second we kind of gave up that option by taking venture capital, which meant really the exit strategy for the venture capitalists was down to sell the company or take it public, and then they could sell their stock to a public market. And going public is nice because you control your company, and public shareholders, if for some reason are mad at you, they just sell the stock. They don't hang in there. So it's kind of all the best of all worlds. You have a way for your employees to easily participate in the success of the company. You can grant stock options. You can acquire companies with stock. You personally can build your own net worth through selling stock. There's just and there's really, there is one bad thing about it, which is that you suddenly have to print your financials every 90 days and give them to everybody in sight. And if the stock price ever goes down, everybody hates you for a few days. And and the intense pressure to make quarters. So there are downsides, but I didn't know about those prior to going public. I was focused on the good parts. And then once you go public, and we were public, in the big leagues. We were on NASDAQ at a time when NASDAQ was kind of the hot place to be, and where the tech companies were going. And we were, kind of the consumer stock. So there was a ton of interest in the company. It wasn't like, penny stocks where nobody cares. We were in the headlines every day, and kind of people paid attention to what we were doing. So that created its own set of pressure because, if somebody out there, in order to be a high flyer, I guess, on NASDAQ, you have to be doing, I think everybody kind of said, the market's growing 50%. You got to grow 50%. And then you look around and you say, how am I going to do that? And you just got to meet that growth. Otherwise, you're not doing what shareholders bought your stock wanting you to do. And at the time we went public, mentally, I kind of thought of it as I had a new boss. Now, suddenly, all of those investors out there who bought Sierra stock bought it, and I worked for them. And my job was to figure out how to sell software and keep up with market growth. So,
gotcha. Yeah, I believe you guys go public in, is it 87 or 88?
I think we tried in 86, and in October 86, there was a market crash. And then we went again in 87, and that went smoothly. So I think it was 87 we went public.
Okay. And so now you're a publicly traded company. You have the numbers coming out. And with that, now, obviously, at this point, Sierra is very well known for the personalities of the designers of the game. So everybody looks at the back of the box, can see Roberta's face, can see Al's face, can see the two guys from Andromeda, and so on and so forth. And you have this model where the designer gets royalties on the game, and everybody else who's working on the game is an employee of the company, if I understood the model correctly. Or do you also have the artists working as freelancers?
No, pretty much everybody was an employee of the company. We didn't do a lot of freelance. Really, the only royalty people were the designers.
Gotcha. And did the designers also get any kind of stock options, or was there any relationship there, or were they purely product by product compensation?
I think they were product by product. I don't remember any of them getting stock options. I don't remember any getting stock options. I think they were strictly royaltied. So,
okay.
And so they, I wanted them to really have a huge stake in the success of their product. And there may have been some where I gave some royalty advance so that they could pay their rent. But really, I wanted them to either starve or get rich, and hope that that entrepreneurial spirit would kick in, and they would want the fame and money that came from having a hit product. So that was, and that was kind of where things went wrong after I sold the company, and there was a different mentality than a lot of the other companies in the industry had. And the first thing they wanted to do was get rid of those big royalties to the designers. And whether that was right or wrong, it was just the wrong decision at that point in time. And in a way, I looked at it like, the $2 or whatever I gave Al Lowe for each game that sold. I mean, that was, he may have got 2, but I got 10 or something. And it was a win-win, and when you can create a win-win for everybody, that's, that really should be the goal. And it worked. It worked. I could have done options, and I think we probably did some options in some cases for some people, but I just don't remember doing it. So.
Gotcha. Now, it's also around this time that there was an attempt to unionize Sierra. And you talk about this at length in the book, and it's the emotional effect of it, I believe, on you was quite big from what I was reading in the book. And you also talk about how you were perceived to have preferences for certain people. You put certain people higher up and so forth. Walk me through the situation before this union organizing happened, and in hindsight, what would you, from a managerial standpoint, would have had to have done in order to prevent that from even getting to that point?
We were overworking people, clearly. I remember, Rick Cavan was kind of my hatchet man in those days. He was my right-hand guy, and I would go to Rick. I always had a problem telling people things that they didn't want to hear. So it was nice to have a buffer between me and the team. And I would go to Rick, and I would say, here we are in October. Christmas is rolling up in like 10 weeks. We got a lot of work to do. Let's get it done. Mandatory overtime. And in those days, and maybe still, there was a whole category of employee that's kind of considered a professional. And if you're, an accountant or a lawyer or a software developer, and the company needs you to work 12-hour days, you just got to work them. And we did 12-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week for probably 2 and 3 months in a row. And we needed it. I mean, we needed really to get that product out for Christmas. And in our business, Christmas was magic. I mean, Christmas was when we booked probably 60% of all of our revenue. We would do between November 15th and December 31st. So if that product wasn't there, you could cut the sales estimate in half or down to a third. So suddenly, instead of making money, you lost money on the game because, you've seen it with people dieting in January. They'll pig out in November and January, February, they're all on a diet. Well, it's a little that way with software, because people are getting new joysticks for Christmas. They were getting sound cards. They were getting mice. They were getting new computers. And in those days, we'd even think of it, for every computer that's sold, they're going to buy 5 pieces of software. How do we make sure that at least 3 or 4 of them are ours? Mm-hmm. And so we would plan all year for our Christmas promotions, and the product had to be there. And frequently, in fact, always, software delivers late. I mean, it's hard to bring a product in on time and on budget. And so we would suddenly start getting to September, October. We'd say, oh, crap, we're going to miss Christmas with some of our bigger products. And I'd go to Rick and I'd say, okay, no more weekends off. And he'd go out to people. We wouldn't offer him any more money, and they'd work nonstop. And from my perspective, I was trying to save their jobs. And from their perspective, I was kind of the evil person making them work through weekends. And both sides are right. I can't fault either of us for that. But we did what we had to do, and everybody worked around the clock, and we got the games out. And if you ask all the same people today, they wish they had a time machine and we could go back and do it again because it was good times. But ultimately, it led to union organizing by a screwy union. It was the Machinists Union out of Fresno, the IAM, and they wanted to unionize our software developers. At first, when I heard about the union organizing, because I kind of heard rumors in the company, I assumed that they wanted to go after our manufacturing group. But they were interested in the high-paid software engineers because if they could beat us, they could then go into Silicon Valley and go after Apple and Atari and all the big companies there. And we were kind of a slam dunk case because we had really been abusive, I guess you'd say. And even I knew that. I mean, it was you kind of sometimes in life you do what you got to do, and then you look back on it later and you say, "Gosh, I wish I hadn't done that." But we may not have ever reached the next year had I not done what I had to do sometimes. So what happened though, which was kind of interesting, was that our manufacturing group, several of the people in our manufacturing group had been union workers for other companies, and I wasn't allowed. There's kind of a whole protocol when union organizing is going on. And I wasn't allowed to talk to our employees. I couldn't fire, I couldn't promote, I couldn't do anything. I really had to stay hands off. And they would have their union organizing meetings, and it was all leading to a big vote. And the manufacturing team, who wasn't in the group that was going to be unionized, but had experience with working as a union worker, showed up for that meeting, several of them, and gave really passionate speeches about how the guys did not want to be unionized. And that's what really saved the day, probably not just for us, but for a lot of the industry. Because if we had rolled over, a lot of the industry probably would have. And it was, and I guess I did learn out of it because I do think we got better after that. And although I can't imagine how, because games still ship late, and we had to pitch in and get them out the door. So, and in fact, when we stopped pitching in and getting them out the door after I sold the company, games got horribly late, missed Christmas, went crazy over budget, and you notice there's no more Sierra. So, there is kind of a you got to do what you got to do sometimes, and if you don't, then bad things will happen. So yeah, that was a sad time because it felt like I was being stabbed in the back by my own employees, and I really should not have felt that way. Now that I'm older and a little more, more reflective on it, I look back at what we did, and I do feel pretty bad about how hard we worked people. So.
There is that scene in Space Quest 3 with the whips and the chains and.
Yeah, I know. That's true, though. I mean, it was really almost that bad. We worked people pretty hard. Even we would have them sleep at the office. We would rent hotel rooms. I had an upstairs at my house, and I remember for weeks when Al Lowe was there running one of the projects, and the whole team had to sleep kind of upstairs at my house. And it was just, I don't know. I mean, you do what you got to do, and that's what we did. So,
gotcha. Now, it's also around this time, a year or so later, that you guys move from the AGI system to the SCI system. Now, this was a major change in the technology. You guys had always done more and more options in the old engine, but this was new graphical resolutions, new options were possible in the animation and so forth. How does a decision like that from a corporate standpoint happen? Because it's obviously a big investment in the new technology, a long time to develop it. And of course, you're also working with scheduling games that have to be made in this engine that also have to hit stores. What was that experience like, making that major technological upgrade?
Yeah, it probably wouldn't have happened if it wasn't that I was an engineer. Jeff Stevenson, who was probably our lead engineer at the time, and a real genius, an incredible guy, came into me one day and said, there's this new thing called object-oriented programming, and we should be doing it. And I had not a clue what it was and didn't really understand it. And he started talking about properties and methods and things I had never ever heard of, and showed me sample code with, suddenly start getting into event-driven systems where, you can tell an animation, close the door, and it'll ping you back later when the door is fully closed. And then you start understanding that you could reuse that same object that closes the door to close a window. And because it's really just different graphics and how you open and close the thing. So Jeff took a while to convince me, and I really wasn't convinced and really didn't want to do SCI. But, sometimes you just got to kind of go with your gut and trust your people. And if you've got somebody who's, clearly a AAA player, knows what he's doing, and is telling you you're on the wrong track, you got to listen. And it was so there was multiple components to it. There was enhanced utilities, but that affected our tools group. But there was also the compiler to compile this other language. Some of it rolled over. Some of the guts, how the interpreted code worked, and the device drivers and some of that stuff moved from AGI to SCI. It wasn't a complete starting with a blank sheet of paper. But it kind of was, in that the other thing that happened is AGI was like programming in BASIC or something. And then suddenly SCI is more programming in C++ or C++ or C. And and none of our programmers knew how to do that. They were all hostile to the concept. And so it was a little bit of retraining. And whereas in the early days, even guys like Al Lowe, who had been a music teacher and were never really trained as a programmer, could program the games. I mean, AGI is a pretty simplistic language, and SCI, suddenly you're getting into where you need a real engineer. And so that it wasn't just the technology that changed. The people that were using the technology had to change and become, a different grade of programmer. And but we did it, and it turned out to be the best thing we ever did, and allowed us to do kinds of games that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. There was a lot of things that were developed using SCI that weren't adventure games. Our Dr. Brain series, I'm trying to think, I'm blanking on what else, but and all of TSN, I mean, that was all written in SCI. And that was, kind of a whole online gaming network, all coded in our SCI programming language. So it was, it was the best thing that ever happened to Sierra, and I thank Jeff for that. And still amazed that I listened to him. Like you said, it was a big switch for us. So.
It was a huge switch. It changed the quality of the games in many ways. Now, and we need to talk about TSN, but before we get to it, I did want to talk about another big technological change, which was the move from EGA to VGA.
Mm-hmm.
Because number one, it must have had a major effect on the budgets of the games because of the investment in the artwork and so forth that was required for the games. Was that a major change in the development time and budget?
Yeah. Well, and what happened coincidentally with that was, remember, I always had this vision for what I thought a game should look like, and I always wanted to go into Hollywood to get people. And a guy named Bill Davis, who I don't know if anybody knew his name outside Sierra, but he had been an artist in Hollywood. And I think his claim to fame was he was doing all those little sign cards for the old Johnny Carson show. They were kind of cool to come up. And, and I'd watched the Johnny Carson in my day. Nobody alive remembers him, but he was pretty big at his time. And Bill came into us, and I made him creative director and gave all the artists and musicians to him and said, I want, Hollywood quality, figure it out. And it was a culture change inside Sierra. And Bill, to his credit, understood how to get different art styles. He understood how to manage a team of artists, not just to be an artist. And and he had, as picky as I was on quality, Bill was 50 times what I ever dreamed of being. And he was, and he had the respect of the people. So they would come to Sierra just to be able to work with Bill. And it was Bill, more than anything, it wasn't just the technology, because, a great enough artist. You take, Tiger Woods and give him a miniature golf club and he's still going to beat me. And Bill was like that in art. It would have, the more I could give him, the more he could get out of it. But even with crayons, he could do great things. And so I knew that, at that point, that we had nailed it in art. We were always going to do everything that the machine had in it to do. And so Bill took over music and art, and he was, he just exuded. Everybody that came in touch with him loved the guy and respected him and knew that they were going to be better through working with him. So it wasn't just the technology. It was the recognition, I'm getting big enough that we could afford to spend the money to do better. Because instead of, on Mystery House, Roberta did her own graphics, and it shows. And suddenly you start getting to where you're doing the Disney product, and the quality art becomes a much bigger deal, and the percentage of the project flowing into art, had gone from 0% to 10% to 20%, and suddenly there were more artists than there were programmers on a project. And managing art is it's quite a deal, because when I was talking about Garrett, and I talked about some people being creative and some being business oriented. Most of the artists I ever dealt with were more creative and perfectionists than they were business oriented. Going into an artist, it would always frustrate me, because at the beginning of the game, I'd say, I want a list of what animations we're going to try to do, and then let's compute how many sales for each animation we're going to have. And the artist would look at me like I was a total idiot, like, we don't understand. We're going to draw this character till it looks good, and then if we need him to do something different, we'll draw him until he looks good. And left to their own devices, you'd wind up with one character that looked beautiful, but it would take 9 months to get the character. And I needed, and so when it came to simple concepts, like how many frames of animation are there, so I can see if it'll fit on a CD, those kind of things, even Bill, much as I love Bill, never quite, he was better than 99% of artists, but in general, trying to get an art department to tell you how many cells there's going to be, how many animations there's going to be, and when it's going to finish is, it exceeded my capabilities. to say the least. So, but we got through it. But wow, that was a project. So
I'll believe it. Now, something else that happens around this time is that Sierra began doing re-release or VGA remakes of several of the first games in a variety of series.
Yeah, well, I mean, the market today kind of is what it is. If you marketed a game, all the people that want to play it are going to kind of play it, unless you roll it into another country or something. And in those days, household penetration of PCs was going, 5%, 10%, 20%, 25%. And plus people were getting new computers that were radically different than their prior computer. So it was almost like the market was refreshing itself plus growing. And so the people that played Space Quest 1 in 1982 or whatever would be completely different group by 1987, and they'd never seen it. And yet, because we were on this interpretive language, we could just roll the game over pretty easy and keep the same design. And instead of spending, $500,000 on a new game, I was spending $35,000 or $50,000 for a upgrade. And,
oh wow! It was really that cheap.
Yeah, it was that cheap. I mean, it was really just because they were coloring on top of the old graphics. They weren't starting with a blank sheet of paper. In some cases, they might have, but in general, I mean, those upgrades were dirt cheap. I mean, they were $30,000 to $50,000, and then you just put them right back out in the market as a new product. And whereas the first version might have needed to sell, 30 or 40,000 copies to break even, its development budget, those upgrades were like 3,000 copies, and then all of a sudden, every other copy falls straight to the bottom line.
Gotcha.
So it was a immensely profitable business for us, and even people that bought the game the first time would go back and buy it again because they wanted to see it on a new machine and more colors. And we would sometimes get the original designer involved to fix things in the game and fix a puzzle that was too hard the first time around. But I tried not to do too much of that because at $30,000 I like the project better than at $300,000. So there was those were immensely profitable. They helped, and they also helped the division heads, because when we talk about that. They had to have a sales forecast that gave a certain level of revenue for the amount of money they had to spend to develop. And they liked those. They were kind of gimmies. You go back and take an old product and you don't spend a whole lot and you get nice revenue out of it, and it covers mistakes in other areas. So.
Gotcha. Now, one of the stories I've heard over the years was that one of the additional impetuses for the VGA remakes was that Sierra always did very good business with its back catalog, which wasn't always the case with a lot of companies. Every time you bought a Sierra game, you had the wonderful catalog in there, and you could pretty much order every game that Sierra had ever produced at any time. And the story that I heard, and please confirm it or tell me it's wrong, was that the introduction of VGA with King's Quest V and other titles started to hurt the back catalog, that the back catalog stopped being as desirable or as revenue generating as it had previously been. Was that true, or was that not the case?
I don't remember that. I mean, I always saw it as a revenue opportunity, fairly cheap to go update them and take the money. I mean, if anything slowed it down, it would probably just be that hardware quit changing so much from version to version. I mentioned in the book I had, a 3-year-old iPad and a current iPad, and I can't tell the difference. And but you probably, I mean, you've been around long enough. You remember when they went from, how was it they used to grade the processors in PCs, and you would say this one's 2 times as fast or 8 times as fast?
Yeah, you would look at the megahertz speeds on the chips, and then with the Pentium 2, I think it was, where you basically had the first processor that was really a dual-core processor because it had a math coprocessor on it or something. Suddenly, the megahertz numbers didn't really mean the same thing. And nowadays with the multiple core processor, you have no idea what the megahertz, what the speed of the CPU really means for the performance, because, well, if you're playing a game, your CPU really doesn't matter because it's all now the video card. And then you look at the video card, and then you've got a multi-core video card, and it's got this generation, and then it doesn't even matter how fast it is. The question is, which features does it support? And it's gotten to the point where I'm playing games that came out 6-7 years ago, and I'm perfectly happy with that, and I'll catch up at some point in the future. But
I understand that. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure what happened. Maybe it flattened the curve a little bit, but
yeah. Well, I was thinking
those, they were so cheap. Why not? Well, the big one that came in toward the end was bundles. We discovered bundling where we could take all 4 or 5 or 6 King's Quest games and call it the King's Quest bundle, or we did the Roberta Williams anthology. We sold a ton of those. We and then we bundled like our NASCAR product with bass fishing, and and in Walmart, I mean, we sold a pile of those things. I mean, it was bundling became a big deal because suddenly you could tell people, we've got $200 worth of product here that we're going to sell for $29, and it's a special promotion, and yet for us, we just copied them all onto the same CD, or put in a couple of CDs, and life was good. So we made money on this upgrades. Well, and then we also had foreign translations, because you could take the game that was in English, and because of the way SCI worked, the text was all stored separately, as was the voice, and you could pay somebody. Once again, you'd be a $25,000 or a $50,000 rollover, and you've got a French version, and you break even at 3,000 or 4,000 copies, and the rest is gravy. So our back catalog was a big deal for us, and we pushed it. So and it worked.
Oh, definitely. Like I said, I came to the party fairly late, around 1990 is when I finally had a system that could play Sierra games, and I have an almost complete set of the Sierra Adventures released for the Amiga. I mean, it's a big shelf. And I've played through every single one of them with the exception of King's Quest 3. You can tell Roberta from me that thing was just way too hard.
I'll tell her. And I've never been a gamer. It's funny, other than Leisure Suit Larry and Space Quest, I never really, and then Phantasmagoria, I never really played the Sierra games. I had to look at them and grade them, but I don't know, whatever part of my person. I love chess, and I like backgammon, and I played the games that made me laugh. And then I loved the Dynamix product. I mean, I was really big fan of Incredible Machine and Aces and Red Baron and, what's some of the others there? I mean, all of them. They did some cool things. So
the Stellar 7, Nova 9. Like I said before the podcast, Dynamix, this company that I followed before Sierra bought them and through its entire life. It's a company that always just kept amazing you.
Yeah, Jeff Tennell there and Damon Sly. I mean, they were pretty. I mean, that was the coolest thing about Sierra, was because we were an industry leader, people wanted to work for us. So if you were kind of a rock star game designer or developer, you couldn't do better than to work for Sierra. And so people came to us. I mean, it isn't like I did great things. People would call me and say, "I'm a superstar. Do you want me?" And I'd say, "Sure."
And how did Dynamix was the first company that Sierra purchased? How did that happen? Did you approach them? They approached you. What was the process of purchasing a developer at that time?
I have no idea how we first met. I'll have to ask them. Probably we ran into them at a show and they were showing off their product, but I don't know how they published their product before us.
They were at Electronic Arts right before you guys. No, sorry. They had a standing contract with Electronic Arts. In 1989, they released their final product for them, which was Project Firestart. And at the same time, they're publishing games for Activision. They released Die Hard for Activision in the same year.
Yeah.
And then you guys picked them up, I believe, in 1990 is when Dynamix becomes a Sierra company.
I mostly remember them from Aces and Red Baron. I think they already had Aces of the Pacific at that time. And I think they also did Aces over Europe or something. But those were Sierra products.
Those were Sierra products. Oh, they also did 2 games that they published themselves. It was A10 Tank Killer and Chris Wolf.
That spy game. Because I remember A10 real well. That went out as a Sierra product.
Yeah. At first they did it themselves, and then you guys reissued it with a new cover. Yeah.
My guess is they had a booth at a computer show, and I went up to them and said, and I knew I needed into the 3D space. It was a huge hole in our product line, and I could see that I had to be there. We had no product in that space, so I was actively looking for anybody that had a 3D engine. There was no hardware. Well, I guess hardware was starting to happen at that time, and maybe not. I just remember I needed a 3D engine, and I wanted a flight simulator. And I must have stumbled into them either in an ad or at a computer show and just called, I guess it would have been Jeff Tennell, and said, can we acquire you? And I'm pretty quick. When I know that I want something and it fits, I'm sure I just jump straight to, can you be acquired? And I flew down and met him, and we worked out a deal. So I don't remember what I paid for him. I don't remember it being a bunch. It probably would have been, $1 million in stock or something like that.
Gotcha.
And we were a public company at the time. And as a public company, you don't have to, in those days, it was, it would have been, 30 years ago. But they had something called a pooling of interest transaction where you could issue stock and it didn't hit your bottom line at all. So I could
really?
Much as I wanted, and it was just dilution. I didn't have to report it as profit or loss.
And you didn't have to get any kind of approval from the board or from the shareholders for that dilution?
Well, I guess there were shareholders, but at that small a transaction, no shareholder vote. So it was really just the board. And there must have been some carve out up to, 10% of the company or something. I know if I'd wanted to do a material deal, and an immaterial deal, something that's less than 10% of your shares outstanding. I definitely did not have to do. In fact, for none of our acquisitions did I ever go out for shareholder approval. The only one was Fairytales when we were going to acquire them, but that was half the stock in the company, and that required a shareholder approval. But for Dynamix and stuff, really, it was more a matter of call my board and say, I want to do this. Are you guys okay with it? And they thought I walked on water at that point. We'd risen from the dead, to say the least, and we're flying high. And so when I called and said, can we acquire this company? They said, sure. And it was a great acquisition. And we had such a good experience with it that nobody questioned any of our other acquisitions. Everybody was excited about them. And it was really done to fill what I perceived as holes in the product line. Categories I wanted to be in that I thought were strategic for us. And, like Coktel Vision. It wasn't their products. Well, it was 2 products. It was that they were number 1 in Europe in education, and they had good European distribution, and we were doing nothing in Europe. And I thought it should be at least half our revenue. So, and they had a bright guy that ran the company. So it was a strategic acquisition for us. It kind of filled 3 niches that I knew, or three slots I needed to fill in our product line. I needed distribution. I wanted to be number 1 in education, and it helped me get there. And so that was all of, if you look at all of our acquisitions, it was some category I felt I needed to be in, and I was filling in a vacancy. So.
Gotcha. Jumping a little ahead on my notes, but with the Coktel Vision thing, I was wondering whether or not there was a distribution angle to that acquisition. But in addition to that, had there been any attempts by Sierra to improve international distribution prior to that?
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, I mean, in Japan we tried and failed miserably, but that was more of a platform issue. There just really wasn't a machine in Japan that our games would run on that was a big enough installed base. They had the NEC 9801, which was kind of a IBM compatible machine, but was pretty different. And even at small numbers, it was just too small in numbers. We couldn't make it work. And we tried in Europe, but mostly through licensing product, where we'd tell somebody, take our product, pay us $1 a copy, and go sell it. And that didn't work. I mean, we got a little bit of revenue, but nothing material. Sorry. And then I stumbled into Coktel Vision, probably at a computer show. I mean, in those days, they had a show called CES, and people would come in, and I think Coktel Vision was looking to sell their product in America. And I met their founder, a guy named Roland Oskian, something like that. And he was awesome. And when he started talking about being #1 in education in Europe, and I went, yep, check, I need that. And then he had a big operation out of Versailles near Paris. And I was a little worried about that because the French are not loved in every country, and especially the UK, and a lot of software was being in the UK. And but he said he had put together a UK office for me, and I believed him, and he did actually do it, although there was always tension between the UK and France. But he did it, and and when at the time we sold the company, I think we were doing more revenue in Europe than we were in the US.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that was all driven by Roland Oskian and our French operation.
Cool. In the acquired companies, Papyrus, Dynamix, Coktel Vision, and so forth, what you gave them a lot of leeway to manage their own affairs.
Right.
Now, how did that mesh as far as the compensation models and licensing and so forth? Because the packaging of these other studios' games always stood out a little bit from the standard Sierra owned developed packages. So what was the management model and management decisions there like?
Well, I did not want to change the companies that I acquired. I wouldn't have acquired them if they didn't have a successful business model and a successful management team in place. So they kind of understood their market, and they understood how to talk to their customers. All I wanted to do was lift up the bureaucracy and make their life easy. Manufacturing, nobody was going to buy a product because my manufacturing is better than your manufacturing. No one's going to buy a product because my HR department's better than yours, my legal department. There's all this crap that winds up being 30 or 40% of the total cost of a product that has nothing to do with why to buy the product. So what I wanted to do, and if you ever listen to like Warren Buffett when he talks about buying companies, he talks about looking for management teams that know what they're doing, that he can leave in place. Help them where you can, but don't screw up a good thing. Too many people will buy a company and then try to take your strategies and layer them onto that company, and that may or may not fit. I can take my clothes and give them to somebody else, and they may fit and they may not, but probably not. So, and I wanted people that really were passionate about a category or a product. And what sold me on Dynamix was the manuals that they were doing for the products, for like A10 and Aces and Red Baron. That was clear that these guys got it. They were excited about flight simulators, and a lot of people would have bought them and said, well, we don't need those manuals, or let's put in Control H, pops up a help screen. But no, these guys, you don't mess with a formula like that. You So what I wanted to do was always say, let's take the crap that nobody cares about, and I'll lift that crap off of you, and you just keep building product. And I wanted them also to control their own marketing. I wanted them to figure out what their packaging should look like, what the manual should look like. In fact, I even wanted them to work out their own business plan. I really just wanted to say, you tell me what you want to sell. I'll go over to my sales force. They'll tell me how many they think they can sell. And then you can have 25% of that number back as your budget. And then how you spend that money, what you do, you figure that part out. And that worked. So if they could show me, $20 million for the product, I'd give them $5 million, and they could figure out how to spend it. And we cared a little about the product, but my answer, I struggled to say yes. I mean, no matter what they asked, because ultimately it was up to them to grow or shrink their company. And it's just part of human nature. If you're running a company, you want to see it grow. So they're not going to do dumb things. If somebody ever actually did a dumb thing, I'd probably have gotten rid of them. But they didn't do that. They all wanted to see their brand grow. And so just really a matter of me taking all the other stuff off their plate, letting them focus on building products. And really, I only left them two pieces: product development and marketing. And some of them got big enough where they'd have an HR person locally, like Dynamix. I don't know how big they were, maybe 100 employees, and they needed a local HR person. But in general, it was either you were building product or you were putting together the packaging and the instruction manuals. The instruction manuals were always local with them. I would talk them into putting the Sierra name on the front of the package, so it would say in the lower left corner Sierra, and the lower right Dynamix or Papyrus or whoever. But I just wanted them to have their own brand identity with their customers, and with some like Impressions. The Impressions product was more of a board gamer strategy game type product, and people that were into that kind of game loved Impressions products. And they understood how to do the manual. They understood how to do the box. And really, all I had to do was just get out of their way, give them the budget. And we did do an annual strategy meeting, we called it, where I brought in the head of all the divisions. And we kind of talked about what we were going to do over the next year. And we would talk about which machines we were going to support. And then, and I always kind of like unanimous opinion. So we'd kind of debate it out until everybody kind of agreed on what we were going to do. And then after that, I really would oppose anybody trying to do a mid-course correction. It's kind of like if we decide we were going to support these three machines and you now come up with a fourth machine you want to do it, I'd say that's great. Add it to next year's strategy meeting. And at the end of the year, we'd get together and we'd talk again about the following year. But for, during, it's kind of like there's a time for planning and a time for execution. And when it comes time to execute, any other thoughts of distraction. If that's a good idea, we should have talked about it. But that was how we ran the company, and it worked. The guys felt like they were running their own businesses and like they had their own responsibility for product strategy. If I thought of something that seemed like a natural for their technology, I would say it. But ultimately, if their business failed, it wasn't me that was going to be hurt. It was them. So I wanted people to have ownership and feel like they really were building a company. So
gotcha.
Long answer, short question. So.
No, excellent answer. And you go into that in much more detail in the book. And I know I'm pushing the book because it really is a great read for people who are interested in this. But you mentioned there the idea of if somebody wanted to support a platform, then you had to bring it to the next year. And that begs a very big question. Sierra has almost no, in the post-crash period, virtually no presence on consoles, even though the NES gets big. Now, King's Quest V got a port to the NES. King's Quest I made it to the Sega Master System. And then Dynamix released several games for the Sega CD, for the CD add-on. And I believe there was a King's Quest V version for the system that was announced but then canceled. Can you tell us a little bit about the any plans or the thoughts that went into those games and why there weren't more of them?
Yeah, I mean, the disappointing answer is that it just wasn't strategic for us. We never, set out at a meeting and said, let's do that. If somebody called us, if Sega would call us and say, we want to license it and we'll give you 200 grand plus $1 a copy and we'll do all the work and you can get all the credit and some of the profit, I would say, sure. But if it wasn't decided at one of our strategy meetings and we weren't willing to allocate serious resources to it, we just didn't do it. And in my time, there was really no machine that felt like we could really do it well. We kind of thought about, some of the higher end Nintendo machines toward the end, but they weren't hooked to the internet yet. They didn't have big storage. It wasn't clear how to do a save game or to save game position. They still had the screwy business model where you had to buy them for $14 or $15 a piece. So it was a thin gross margin. And no part of me wanted to commit to taking 50,000 up front or 10,000 copies to sit in a warehouse. So we may have dipped our toe in the water from time to time through licensing. And if say we had licensed Sega and they had sold a bunch of copies, we might have added it to the strategy for the following year. But I really always just kind of considered it a distraction. Plus, our people weren't developing for those systems and weren't excited about them. Ultimately, the thing that was the core part of Sierra strategy always was to find people who were passionate about doing something, that would have done it, whether I was paying them or not. And, you can't go into a guy that's been programming for IBM and say, hey, do you want to program something for the Sega? I mean, he'll do it, he'll take your money, but he's not going to be passionate about it. If I was going to go after the Sega, I would have had to find, I probably would have gone to my engineers and said, is there anybody here excited about programming for the Sega? And if nobody said yes, then I'd be toast at that point. And there was a lot of things, over the years where I'd wanted to do them. But if nobody was kind of foaming at the mouth to do it and begging me, then I just wouldn't do it because I wanted to flow backwards from product, not flow backwards from a spreadsheet. I didn't want to say, Doom sold 200,000 copies. We need a Doom game. It was kind of like if it sold 200,000 copies, I might start watching for somebody that would be passionate about doing something similar. But I was never going to take somebody that was doing some other category. And, even Leisure Suit Larry with Al Lowe. I went to him and said, do you think this would be fun? And then he got excited about the humor because he's a funny guy. But if he had said, nah, I don't really want to do that, that would have been the end of it. I do think part of the magic of Sierra was that nobody got forced to do anything they didn't want to do other than working through a Saturday and a Sunday. That we're guilty of.
Okay. And it did show in the product. You mentioned in the book that I think it's every player should feel like they know the designer.
Right. That's what I always say. The player has to feel like they're at lunch with the designer. And to the extent I can't protect that vision, then it's not going to work.
And as somebody who's interviewed Al Lowe and played all of his games, I can say, I knew what I was getting into when I went to the interview, and I definitely experienced that man.
Yeah. Well, it's like even my book, I could have, in fact, I thought for years about, I should probably get a ghostwriter and write a book about Sierra, but it would have been wrong and it would have been cheating. I know I'm not a great writer. And there was even a time when I had to go back through the book and add thousands of commas because I didn't do them the first time, and then everybody kind of rebelled. And then I started learning about some sort of weird comma. And
the Oxford comma.
Yeah, the Oxford comma. Yeah, you'll notice that in some parts of the book they're there and some parts they're not. And it was, although I went back and I tried to find every place and put them in. So it's, but people, I think, like the fact that when they read it, my personality comes through. And had a ghostwriter written it, then that personality would have been missing. And that's part of the beauty of a book, is because you really do get this nice connection to the person that wrote it, and you can love them or hate them, but at least you got an attitude. And that was really, throughout Sierra, that was the message, is I want people to like the people, not the products. Because they'll forgive the product, if it's not perfect. But if you like the person who built it, and you see what they were trying to create, and the passion comes through, then you got a cool product. So
very true. And so there's obviously 1,000 other stories. The id purchase that almost was, the merger with Roterbund. But I do want to, I don't want to take up too much of your time. We do have to talk a little bit about sort of the end of Sierra.
Sure.
And the CUC. And I'll be honest, as somebody who was following the news at the time, I never quite understood what had happened there. I never understood what CUC was. Suddenly, I was reading reports about it. The parent company was a thing called Sendent, and I was wondering, when did that happen? And so on and so forth. And you explain it very, very well in the book. There's one aspect of it that I am curious about, though. The head of CUC, this guy Forbes, I believe, Walter Forbes. Now, he was on the board of Sierra for several years, and you brought him on for his competency with online retailing or online sales. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was for the customer acquisition and customer retention, and kind of we were doing TSN, and it was going to be one of those where you wind up paying $50 or $100 to, in effect, buy a customer, because you run a bunch of ads. And if you say, if I spend $1,000 on ads, I get 10 customers. So there, it's $100 per customer to acquire them. But if the average customer will stay 10 years, then you really only spent, $10 per year to keep that customer. Is that whole how to do a customer acquisition and retention, and then remarketing if you lose somebody, like Netflix and all those companies are experts at today. And he owned companies like RCI and the timeshare resale business, and Welcome Wagon, if you know that. And they were, all of their business revolved around acquiring customers and putting into subscription-based models. And we were doing TSN. And at the time, I was planning on spending, $100 million or something, rolling out TSN and taking on lots of subscribers and becoming the Netflix of subscriber-based online entertainment. And so he was a natural fit for the company. And it wasn't so much the shopping, although I thought of shopping as like a product. He was selling a club where people would pay they'd pay $1 up front to get 3 months worth of the right to shop through his service, and then pay $9.99 or something a month for the rest of their lives. And you could call an 800 number and say, I want to buy a TV, and they would go find the best price for the TV for you, or find the best price for a washing machine. And that model had worked for him, and I wanted to do similar things in our business. And he was a sharp guy. I mean, he went to jail, so he was also a crook. But I guess you can be smart and be a crook. So, and he was a good board member. I mean, there was like his auditors. I think his auditors were Arthur Anderson, one of the big 8 firms at the time, and it basically sunk that company. I mean, it was he was a high flyer, and everybody that knew him thought the company was incredible. And I thought he was incredible, and the company was incredible, and it didn't play out that way once I was inside of it. So, yeah.
And like I said, you go into great detail there. I finally understood that chapter in Sierra's history after reading the book, and it was something that I could never make heads or tails of from the news reports at the time. Now, a couple of more general questions now that we have the timeline stuff out of the way. And I wanted to ask what effect the rise of the software retail chains, the software et ceteras, Babbage's, Egghead software, and so forth, The rise of those specialty stores, what effect did that have on distribution, marketing, and margins for Sierra product?
I mean, it was incredible for us because, in some ways, it froze out the little guy. Because when you get a big chain like that, they don't want to deal with mom-pop people. And even if somebody has a hit product, they don't want to deal for one product. If somebody had a hit product, the buyer for a big chain would be more likely to go to them and say, yeah, we'll carry your product. Why don't you go to Sierra and talk them into picking it up? Because those big chains are, what they call planograms, where they would lay out their shelf space and they would lay it out months in advance. And they said, at this Christmas, these are our kind of top 10 suppliers, and we're going to give 20% of the space to Sierra, 20% to Electronic Arts. We're going to give 5% to Mindscape. And so they'd do for that first diagram, and then they'd go back and say, we've got 10 million worth of advertising going this Christmas, and you're going to be 20% of shelf space. So I need you to pay $2 million to get that. And then you pay it. I mean, it was called co-op money, they would call it, but it was really us paying for their ad campaigns. They'd come to us, and it was a deal that my sales force had to work out. And they would come back to me and they would say, okay, we can have end caps at Walmart, but we're going to have to commit to this much in co-op money. And if and Sierra's budget, say I had 10 million set aside for marketing. Walmart's an important customer, but if they needed $1 million in co-op, they went 10% of my budget. And so I'd have to believe I could sell 10% or more of all of my product at Walmart or Costco. I mean, those guys were, they were a project to deal with, and we did it. But it, I mean, for us, I mean, when you're the big fish, it's awesome because you can afford to write the big checks. The buyers love it. You pay the ads, you get the shelf space, and your competitors are locked off the shelves. In effect, it's it's not really meant, I don't think, as a monopoly, and they probably wouldn't like hearing me say that, but it is, behind the scenes. I mean, it's a pay-to-play market. You don't get a big pallet promotion at Costco without, you got to be willing to take back the inventory if it doesn't sell. And that can cost you a lot of money, just loading up pallets to go to every Costco store or every Walmart store and being able to convince them you'll replenish those pallets within hours if they sell down. It's kind of a big league play. And Sierra was able to play in that arena. And part of what people wanted, that was part of the value that got Sierra acquired, was our European distribution and our US distribution. Because most companies, because we started at the beginning, once somebody's on your order form or in your store, it's easier to buy more product from them than to fire up a whole new supplier. And people, we were there everywhere software was sold, everywhere in the world, because we were there at the beginning and we just kind of grew with the business. And because we were so dominant, I mean, we were just dominant. You could not sell Sierra product. And in fact, I would not have sold the company except I was convinced we now had it locked down. I mean, it was always, I used to tell people that my goal was that my grandkids would be able to buy Sierra product and their grandkids would buy it. And I was absolutely convinced down to my soul that we had nailed it and that Sierra would live forever. Roberta and I didn't need that much money. We were pretty happy. And at that point, I just kind of wanted to retire and live happily ever after. And it was more about, I guess you'd call it legacy, but it was more than legacy. It was I built this thing and I wanted to know it would live forever. And this seemed like a plan that was going to allow me to retire, but allow the company to not only stay alive, but grow. And it didn't turn out quite that way. So.
Very sad. In many, many ways. Now, yeah.
But
I do have one final question, and I asked this of all of my interview subjects. What, in your time in the industry, what was the one trend or event or innovation that you didn't see coming that was huge? And what was the one that you really thought was going to go someplace that ended up just bombing or fizzling out?
Well, I mean, yeah, the one I think back on would probably be the whole cell phone and the iPhone. I mean, because remember, it started with originally they had, what did they call it? It was not the what was the little
BlackBerry
music device that they did? No, for music.
the iPod.
The iPod, yeah, before the iPhone. When I saw that, and originally I think I saw one by Creative or somebody. It wasn't by Apple at first.
Diamond was the first one to do it.
Yeah, there was a few that were there, and I thought, because Sierra at that time was getting into hardware, and I saw that, and it was just too late. I mean, it was around the time when we sold the company. But I would have definitely done music players, and would I have rolled into phones? I don't know. But I was definitely interested in the intersection of hardware and software. And like, what became Peloton. I remember going to our board and to our management and saying, we should be doing that. I was calling some of the companies that were making exercise equipment at that time, saying that I saw kind of a natural fit between giving classes online and especially wanted people on bicycles racing against each other. So, I thought Sierra, I always felt trapped in that people were thinking of entertainment as games, and I saw Sierra as a interactive entertainment company. And so my focus was on what could you do with this intelligent, with an intelligent device, with the power of a computer to entertain or give people fun things to do. And that isn't always a game. In fact, gaming is a tiny piece of it. I mean, that's kids who want to go shoot at things or something. And there's so many more ways to use a computer productively and have fun with your computer. And I wanted to cover all those bases. So I was thinking much bigger than computer games. And, as the markets emerged and all of these other kind of things that come, even video on demand, or when I saw Real Networks and they were streaming, video for the first time, and Rob Glazer showed it to me. And I thought, damn, that should have been Sierra. So, I would like to think that if Sierra were alive today, that games would be 3% of our revenue, and the other 97% would be doing the stuff that Apple did with watches and iPods and iPhones. And, that's where I was trying to move Sierra, was kind of to, and being a leader in education, leader in productivity. I mean, we were doing design your deck, recipe databases. I mean, I was, and it's not that I had anything against games, but, I wanted to own all the categories. I didn't want to own one. Plus, I really thought of games as one of a million things you could do on a computer. And that, when you slice it down smaller and smaller and smaller, then suddenly you're the adventure game company. And then there's, then you layer on these other pieces, but then you still realize you're only tapping 2% of the potential for what you could do with an intelligent device. And so that was kind of my big picture strategy, where I was trying to steer Sierra. And so I was always thinking about what could people do with a computer that we're not tapping into to keep them entertained. So,
gotcha.
Long answer to a short question.
Excellent. Ken, thank you so very, very much for your time. Is there anything you'd like to say to all the old Sierra fans out there?
No, thank you. Thank you for buying the games. Thank you for remembering us. I'm so constantly, Roberta and I are just shocked and amazed that people remember us 25 years after we went on to other things. So, just thank you. And when people send these emails and they say how, they're a software developer today because of what we did at Sierra, I mean, that's pretty cool stuff to think that you changed somebody's life. And and I would add that this book that I wrote it mostly. It's funny in that I wrote it because I thought I had some ideas that people should have, and ideas on management, ideas on how to start. Like I started life with no education and no money and no parents with any money, and somehow managed to crawl out of that. And I think that some of the techniques I used might help others. And if there's even one kid that reads the book and says, maybe I can do something I wouldn't have done otherwise, then that's a hell of a payday for me. So, but I'll leave it there. So, thank you.
That's everybody. A great place to leave it. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed another Video Game Newsroom Time Machine interview. You can leave us comments on Twitter, Instagram, and if you like what we're doing here, drop us a couple of bucks on Patreon. All the links are in the description below.